and I will bring us to the east and talk about urban space and the text that you have read is a text from it's a court final decision, final record of a dispute that made its way to the Lithuanian Tribunal, which was the court of highest instance for the nobility in Lithuania. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, though united, had these separate court systems for these two geographic areas, and the Lithuanian Tribunal was the equivalent of the Crown Tribunal for the Lithuanian part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this text, although you may bring up the issue of the sacred space and profane space, with Jews building sacred space for the Christians, but this is not what I want to go with it. I want to bring us into the question of jurisdiction and the boundaries and divisions that influence the dynamic of the city. So I think before we go into the text, I need to give you a little bit of background. I'll give you a little bit of background about the place, Minsk, and about the legal system that is at play here, because that's what the case is really about the legality of certain actions. Minsk was a royal town, and in fact those divisions, judicial and juridical divisions, are very important for royal towns. Till about mid-14th century, it was the capital of the Minsk Duchy, and then then it became part of the Duchy of Lithuania, and then when Lithuania joined Poland in the late 14th century, Catholicism was introduced, and it became a royal city within the new political entity. In 1496, Minsk received the Magdeburg Law, which created the legal framework for the city administration, very much akin to any of the royal cities in Poland and now Poland-Lithuania. In 1552, Minsk's municipal rights were extended by King Sigmund August by allowing Minsk to have a set fair date. So again, the importance of Minsk as increasingly a center of trade, especially on the route with Moscow. In 1568, Minsk becomes a vojevodstvo, or a palatinate in the area. So we begin to have a Minsk palatinate, and that brings in a number of issues, because once it is formally created, it gives the Minsk as the region representation in the Polish Senate, and it brings in administration, and it makes Minsk the judicial center of the region as well. So you have the noble dietines gathering in Minsk, and you also have the land courts, sądy ziemskie, that begin to gather there. And from 1581, Minsk becomes one of the three cities in the Lithuanian part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth where the Lithuanian Tribunal would meet. The other two were Vilno, and it is mentioned that there were some dealing with Vilno in the text, and Novogródek. Now, Jews in Minsk become really prominent players in Minsk economy from or by mid-17th century. Minsk is a very diverse city. It has obviously Catholics, but Catholics are really a minority. It has the Orthodox Christians. It has some Muslims. We have, even as late as 19th century, we have a mosque in Minsk. There are some Protestant churches, and of course there's a Jewish community. Another actor in in our text are the Jesuits. They are sort of in the background. They're not really in court, but they are part of the story. Jesuits arrive in Minsk in 1650s, 1660s, after the wars with Polish wars with Sweden and then in Russia. The Bishop of Smolensk, which is even farther to the east, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, bequeathed in his will a house in one of the main square, actually, of Minsk. And that house later on would grow and become first the Jesuit church that the Jews are helping to build here, and then becomes a cathedral after the Jesuit order is dissolved in 1770. Becomes a parish in 1773, and then is dissolved, and then it becomes a cathedral of the Virgin Mary in 1798. The church itself is built, or begins to be built, in 1700. They begin to get first donations for money, and it is formally consecrated, although not yet finished, in 1710. So by 1710, it's an actually functioning consecrated space, but again, it's not finished. There are, I'll get to it in a moment, there are wars, and construction continues. Furnishing continues. Altars are not yet fully built and things like that. A bit of modern history about it, because I think it's quite interesting. This cathedral existed till 1948, and then the Soviet government turned it into a sports complex, totally rebuilding and changing the facade. You wouldn't recognize the image, the picture. It was, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Catholic Church began to lobby to have the cathedral rebuilt, and the groundstone was put in 1994. It was totally rebuilt in 1997, and it is now in the main square in Minsk. If anyone has visited Minsk since 1997, is back as the main Catholic cathedral in the city. And when I was looking for images and for plans of Minsk, I couldn't find any city maps of Minsk, and I only could find this photograph on a postcard of this Jesuit church. And I thought, why is it nothing coming up modern? I said, okay, war or something like that. And then I came across this Belarusian Catholic website that had a modern picture, and I couldn't understand why. And then it turned out that it was after 1997, and that was rebuilt in 1997. Now, what is happening in Minsk in around 1710, 1711, when our case makes it to the tribunal, is quite interesting. We have the so-called Northern War going on between Poland, Russia, Sweden, and Minsk is occupied a couple of times. In 1706, Russian troops entered the city, but as allies of Poland against Sweden. They stay there for a little while, and nothing serious happens at that time. But in 1708, Swedish troops occupy the city and stay there for 2 years, and they are only pushed out of Minsk in 1710, when the Russian army occupies. Now, at the same time, we have a famine going on, and there is no money to support the army. So taxes are increasing, there's no food, there's lots of looting and plundering going on at the same time, and the churches are, in fact, devastated. So this very new church that was just consecrated also is damaged at the same time, and I think that's part of the story here. The Kahal, we don't know why Kahal is borrowing money, but it also coincides with the increase of taxation. I couldn't find, at least from here, from the States, and the tax records for that period. However, in 1717, we have data for tax revenue in Minsk, and the taxation, the Jewish, the poll tax, the head tax, Jews in the city paid 2,000 zloty, and that also included the so-called hiberna, which was a tax in support of the soldiers, of 602 zloty. So total 2,602 zloty of taxation of Jews. The taxation of Christians, by comparison, and I'm not sure whether that reflects a different tax rate or whether it reflects simply the population of the city, and it's likely that it reflects the population, was 1,460 zloty plus 20 zloty from the castle. This is taxation from the royal part of the city. Many of the areas that were not under royal jurisdiction, including areas owned by the nobles, would have been exempt from taxation and from municipal jurisdiction. And this is one of the points that the plaintiff, Jarosz Mackiewicz, brings up into court. Now let me talk about the Polish legal system, so you know where these divisions in jurisdiction are coming from. The Polish legal system, as I'm sure was the case elsewhere as well, had several levels of jurisdictions depending on who was the subject of the law. So nobility, the most obviously privileged class, had the so-called land tax or the prawo ziemskie, and had the courts that were of lower level, and then the courts of highest instance, as I mentioned earlier, were the tribunals, the Crown Tribunal and the Lithuanian Tribunal and the Lithuanian part. The clergy was subject of, obviously, ecclesiastic, again, on paper, this is the legal framework of ecclesiastical jurisdiction. And if there were cases involving nobles and clergy, they would go to the courts of the nobility, and that's a gain of the nobility from 1560s. The town dwellers, the Christian town dwellers, were subject to the Magdeburg law or whatever municipal. There were other municipal laws. The Magdeburg law was the dominant legal system in the cities in Poland, but we do have the Helm law, which some of the cities have implemented. It's a minority. The peasants were, of course, also subject to a separate set of law, and was called prawo wiejskie or rural law. At least in the royal domains. In the private domains, they were subject to the private law. Jews, obviously, technically, in cases involving just Jews, as we all know, were subject to Jewish law, and but again, that doesn't mean that they didn't go to non-Jewish courts. We have that, and in the royal domains, they were subject to the Sąd Wojewodziński, which was the Royal Palatine Court, or Royal Court in cases involving Jews and Christians. This becomes complicated in the 16th century when the nobility gains more rights and more over their own domains. And in 1519, nobility gains right over their peasants in their domains. Then 1539 over Jews living in their domains in their cities. And then finally in 1560s with a slew of other rights gained in that period, power over jurisdiction over the towns that are in their private domain. So by late 16th century, we have a distinction between royal and private cities. But the tension and these legal problems that we see play themselves out here really become an issue in royal cities, because there was no royal domain really in private towns. Here you have sections of cities that become private. And we have two legal terms for these sections. sections of cities in royal towns and royal cities. One term is called the juridiki, or in older texts, jurisdiki, and other, which means private districts of separate jurisdiction. And a juridika was a subject of separate communal organization. It was independent of the city, as we've heard Chris mentioned on Sunday. It even, on occasion, would have separate city council, separate courts, even separate town hall if it was big enough. And the juridika, and that's what's more important, again, exempt from the jurisdiction of the city, but also served essentially the interests of the owner rather than the interests of the city. Another category that challenged the jurisdiction, the city jurisdiction, and the cohesiveness of the city jurisdiction over its residents were the so-called libertacje, and that's also what Mackiewicz refers to in his claim. And these were also exemptions from the city jurisdiction, but they were more for specific houses, and again, on occasion, if they were larger tracts of lands, also on tracts of lands. These exemptions were obtained as privileges from the king, because it was a royal city, so the king ceded rights or gave such exemptions to a given individual or a corporation like the church. And one of the most famous example is that of Krakow, that in 1667, apparently over 71% of the land and buildings within the city walls were subject to such exemptions. That is just under 20, just over 28% was actually under the city jurisdiction. Okay, and then the scholars have broken it down to establishing that the 55% belonged to the church, and then 16.7% to the nobility. So you can see that sometimes it became a very serious problem for the city. And these different spheres of jurisdictions do influence the dynamics of life in the city and the interactions between residents from the legal points of view. And when you think about it, the majority of discussions focus of cities and life in the city, if they focus on any interaction or conflicts or tensions, it is between perhaps different classes of citizens or of residents, town dwellers, or perhaps between Jews and Christians. But those juridical differences here also create tensions within one group. Like Jews, here you have a case where this divides not only the city, but divides the Jewish community here. So let's take a look at the text. I think that this text illustrates nicely the triangular conflict between the Jews in the royal parts of the city, the Kahal, and the Jews in this private juridika of Jarosz Mackiewicz, and then the nobleman, the owner, Mackiewicz, becomes the actor in the actual lawsuit. So what happens here? The Jews of the Minsk Kahal, as the text says, and it's 8th line in the first long paragraph. I did break up into paragraphs. The text itself is not in any paragraph. So the paragraphs are an artificial editorial creation of my own. I'll start reading. So the infidel Jews, having borrowed money from the most reverend fathers, Jesuits of the Minsk monastery to satisfy their needs of whatever kind, have committed to pay interest and to supply bricks and stone for the construction of the church. That the Jews borrowed money from the church is a common phenomenon at the time in Poland, so nothing special here. But the problem becomes when the Jews of the Kahal infringe on the autonomy of the Jurydyka, and in order to pay off the loans, are forcing the Jews of the Jurydyka to participate in the process. And what were they doing? They tried to force the Jews of the Jurydyka to provide carts and horses for the transportation of the building material. There is one of the obligations, and the technical term used here is podvody. That was one of the obligations that was actually part of the royal city obligations, and that usually was applied to fulfilling or sponsoring or paying for the transportation of a messenger between the royal cities. So it was a part of a city obligation. Here is what that term and how that term was used in the obligation to provide carts and horses, and also human power to fulfill the obligation related to the debts. Now, this is what Mackiewicz, the nobleman, claims was illegal. Continuing in that same paragraph, next sentence, and violating common law, and the same, that is the Polish parliament, the same constitutions concerning landed property, juridyki, and legal exemptions, and despite the over 150-year-old exemption from the municipal jurisdiction of the Jurydyka in Minsk, owned by the plaintiff this year, 1711, in numerous months and days, they, that is the above-mentioned Jews, illegally and unjustly abused the common duty to provide podvody, or the horse and carts, for the needs of the city, and sent Jews living in the plaintiff's Jurydyka, which is in perpetuity subject to land law, to the Reverend in God Jesuit fathers, and forced the Jews and the servants from this Jurydyka, which does not belong to them, the accused Jews, or doesn't belong to the accused Jews, or the city, to carry bricks and stones with their horses during the day. And they did it by force. They forced them this. And what did they do? How did they do it? And at night, they took them to their homes, that is within the Kahal jurisdiction, or held them in a private prison. And the following day, they forced them to carry the bricks for the Reverend in God Jesuit fathers. And they have unjustly burdened the inhabitants of this Jurydyka with a demand to provide, the podvody, the carts and horses, and demanded payments of 200 zloty from them, threatening them with expulsion and leading the Jurydyka to ruin. The core of the conflict here is the juridical distinction between the private and the royal. Jews living in the private domains were not subject to the legal framework operating in the royal domains. And what Mackiewicz argued, and that's just the following sentence in the next paragraph, is that, again, he emphasizes, citing the common law, same constitutions, exemptions from local jurisdiction, and preservation of the rights of Jews inhabiting in his Jurydyka, and again emphasizing which is not subject to municipal law and is independent of the local Kahal of Minsk, and is in perpetuity subject to the land law. He attempts to extract. They attempted to extract payments, and that again was illegal and should be punished. Now, the Kahal, of course, saw it differently. They saw themselves as the representatives of the Jewish community in Minsk, and they claimed the larger authority, and also what comes with the authority come financial obligations. Clearly, the Jews of the Jurydyka complained to the noblemen that they are being abused by the Kahal and being forced to do all these things that they don't really want to do, and the nobleman goes to the court. Now, it means that this had appeared first somewhere in a lower instance, because that goes to the tribunal. the Jews don't show up in court, so we don't have their side of the story. They choose not to appear, and they are in effect punished to repay the losses.
Could I just interrupt and ask one tiny little question? Do the Jews in the Yuridika belong to the Kahal and pay taxes to it, or not? Or is that, you'll get to that later, so don't pretend I didn't ask.
I don't know. I don't have the data who paid taxes from the Kahal, but I think what is happening here is that they are trying to exempt themselves from the authority of the Kahal, just as that part of the Yuridika was exempt from the authority of the city. So they see it, and the nobleman also sees it, as not part of this. We are not part of this. Kahal belongs to the royal domain. It is not part of, it has no authority over my Jews. So you Jews borrowed some money from the Jesuits, and you take responsibility for us. Don't infringe on the rights of my Jews.
But in general, were there two Kahals or something like that?
No. No, I mean that conflict actually goes beyond the city. We have documents where the Jews in royal cities are actually complaining that they are overburdened by the royal taxation because the Jews in private cities are exempt, and we have petitions to enforce the payment of the taxes by Jews living in private cities because they are Jews in Poland and they are all subject to the taxation. So this conflict over taxes, money between Jews is not. This is just an urban example of what's happening. And again, this division, I think, exacerbated potential conflicts, and it not only in the larger sense broke the cohesiveness of the city jurisdiction, but also the cohesiveness of the Jewish community, and certainly weakened the authority of the Kahal, but also and that broader autonomy. I think what I just would like to end with and open it up to you for discussion is again reiterate the point of that legal coherence and how that those divisions may influence the dynamic in the city life. That though you may not have those boundaries on the ground saying that this, this is the property of so-and-so nobleman, you are leaving the domain of the king, you are entering the domain of the... It's a small town. We're not talking London. We're not talking about Amsterdam. This is a relatively small town. Just by comparison, I don't know what the exact numbers for Minsk are. Maybe someone here would know for Minsk are, but in 1765, I think we have only 12 cities in Poland that have more than 10,000 people. So we are really talking about small towns. They're not really cities. So that proximity and that dynamic, again, they are all one residents of one city, but here you have these further exacerbated conflicts and tensions by these legal divisions that go beyond class, religious, or ethnic membership, but are created by the legal framework of the city. One more point, okay. That this is those divisions, I think, are part of the early modern reality, at least in Poland, and you can think about other places, because precisely we have that breakup of the weakening of the royal authority and a breakup of authority and division into the private and the royal. So in some way, this legal structure is very early modern, at least for Eastern Europe, for Poland-Lithuania. And I'll stop at that.
Just a short question on the language. When the text refers to the two groups of Jews, the one is Jews, then comma burghers, right?
Yes.
And the second is Jews, comma infidels. It's so interesting that the writer here wants to emphasize the economic status of the Jews under his domain, there's no theological charge there. It's just an economic kind of.
Right, they are burgers for him.
Right, and the other Jews not under his jurisdiction, he then kind of lapses into, the more theologically charged adjectives. So it's completely asymmetrical, these descriptions.
You have exactly the same model that you described here of different jurisdictions of certain Jews in various princeships and whatever you want in Germany. For instance, like Fürth is the main example that we can bring in. The community actually was divided into 3 groups belonging to different rulers, And this is really, I think, very typical pre-modern. I absolutely agree with you. Not only Poland.
Yeah, I mean, the question on the Kahal, I think we have examples in the Poznań Swarzędz, that the Swarzędz is a private town, very close to Poznań. Now it's a suburb of Poznań. And Poznań is a royal city, and Jews are moving to the private town. But the Kahal of Poznań tries to claim the jurisdiction over the Jews in Swarzędz, and that results in some tension.
We ought to be able to ascertain some way, I would imagine, from the Vada Barotzot, the nature of whether it's one Kahal or 2 or anything like that in Minsk, and whether these kind of overlapping and competing jurisdictions are reflected in the internal Jewish level, in the nature of their representation at the national Vad level.
No, I don't.
First of all, it's a wonderful text because it does show the way that the structures and developments in the Polish legal system are filtering down and affecting the way the Jews organize their own lives. The argument of the structure of Eurydice, where you have the noblemen succeeding in taking themselves away from municipal jurisdiction, and in private towns they do that with royal jurisdiction in the same way. And here we see it filtering down into a Jewish environment, whereby the way the Jews see their own space, the way they see their own community has changed. The question of whether it be a separate Kahal, I think, is not the way to look at it. We know in a lot of communities, royal and particularly royal communities in royal towns, which is to say, the elite, the wealthiest merchants who had connections with the noblemen would use their connections to extract themselves from Kahal jurisdiction. So they would not be subject to the rulings of the Kahal. They would not be subject to the rulings of the rabbinical court. They would have a doctrine that said this Jew is directly subservient, directly under the jurisdiction of the noble, and no one else can interfere. And I think that's what's happening here. They're not looking to make another Kehillah.
No, but when they take a member of the elite, as you're describing, and throw him in a prison, as he said.
It's money.
No. That's what the people in the Eurydice are trying to do. They're not interested in setting up a second Kahal. They're just interested in not being part of the Kahal itself.
I'm saying it doesn't suggest that they were elite members who had secured.
No, I didn't say they were. I think in other towns you see where the people have a connection. In a Eurydice, you don't need a personal connection with the magnate because anyone who lives there, by definition, has that connection. It doesn't have to be an elite, but it's one phenomenon which is in fact the breakdown of communal authority in Poland, as part of the general breakdown of structures of authority in the state in that period anyway. The interesting question from the Kahal side would be, very often these loans are taken to build a synagogue. And so the Kahal has taken a loan.
But here the interest is to build the church.
Okay, well that's part of Polish Jewish life. That's how it goes. But the synagogue presumably served the whole community.
We do have...
So the Eurydice Jews wouldn't have built in the Eurydice a separate synagogue. They might have had a shtiegel, but they very likely went to the main synagogue, which was built with this loan. So the Kahal will be absolutely justified in saying to the people in the Eurydice, this is part of your... you're using the synagogue, you pay. Yeah, pay dues, exactly. And if that happens to be by transporting, then that's what it is. However, one last comment, and I'll stop. The question of podvody, the question of transporting, is a very difficult question in Poland. It's probably the most hated of all the feudal Jews that the feudal lord can impose on his subjects. They absolutely loathed it, all of them. And in most private towns, the Jews have negotiated with the noble lord pay money instead of having to do it. So one of the reasons why Jews in noble cities pay higher taxes than the non-Jews, because they don't have to do this kind of horrible thing of getting up from your job, leaving your work, and running off with a cart or sending a letter somewhere. Yeah, Milui, exactly.
No, it's the robot. It's like the robot. It's the.
Yeah.
It's the
But here, Davka, who's forcing these Jews to do it? It's not the nobleman, and it's not the municipal council. It's the Kahal is forcing them. This is really needle. This is really needle.
I think Ken and Bernie and then Chris.
Just a quick one. The exemptions, of course, isn't necessarily early modern. I think it's a unique problem. I know it certainly exists in Mediterranean cities, Mediterranean communities in the 16th century. There's also the flip side of this thing. They did not like in Rome this business of bishops lending money at interest, because it wasn't just to build churches. They were apparently doing it all the time. And in 1751, which is it, Benedict XVI, I think it is.
Not Benedict XIV.
It's Benedict XIV. Aqua Prima issues this book in which I think this is the point where the papacy ultimately breaks with all past policy, because he says that maybe the monk Rudolph was right, the one who said let's destroy the Jews in the Second Crusade, which is unthinkable in any prior papal document.
That bull is to Poland.
Yes.
Against church
Against
lending money
Yeah.
to Jews.
Yeah, it's an absolutely incredible text, because I think it's the breaking point of papal tradition for Jews. The third thing that I wanted to ask are these terms burghers and the use of the terms common law. What specifically what we're talking about here? I read common law in a Western European setting, I would know exactly what I meant, and that's why the term burgher and the common law, which calls Jews kiwes and members of the corporate body where they live. That's Bartolus from the 14th century. That last citation. What does it mean here? Does it mean something else? And this would help to explain why he says burghers and then citizens and infidels could come anywhere, but it would be exceedingly helpful to know what the status of common law is in Poland.
I think what it means that it is understood that nobles have a special jurisdiction, and this goes against that understanding.
But in Latin, common law is jus comune.
This is not here. No, this is more of a popular, known understanding.
I read.
No, that's not.
Translate this.
As far as I know, it doesn't have any that specific meaning in Polish. But I might be wrong. I don't think it does. No, it doesn't.
I think you mean what would be the equivalent of a jus proprium, which is really a private kind of law. So the common law here is a translation for people like me who are used to Western terms.
It's more like, I think, I don't know.
Customary
law, exactly. Maybe that I should use that. No, and I do want to address the question of early modern. Perhaps it was these exemptions were in the medieval period and other places. I think here that division of the jurisdiction, the exemptions for the nobility that are then essentially applied to the members of the inhabitants of the territory is very much modern, early modern. Again, because of that process of nobility gaining rights against the royal, they cease to be essentially royal subjects, and they become independent agents in the 16th century.
How would you translate for me literally into English the Polish prawie pospolite, or however?
Prawo pospolite. That's what I translate the common.
That I gathered that was it, but it translates literally as customary law, because certainly there were Polish.
No, it would translate pospolite is like
people's law.
No. It's general law, like common law. It's not the customary. Customary would be different. When I worked through the legal system and tried to understand the different levels of legal, the term as a judicial term doesn't appear that there is prawo pospolite means this and this. I think what it really means that everybody understands this. And then you have those constitutions, and then you have those privileges, this libertacje, and then you have that. And this goes all against that.
Yes, and this is, we call it Weistum in German. This is what everyone knows. You don't
Yeah.
have to write down that.
I think that the Pospolite means that it's just so common. Everybody knows it. I mean, what are you talking about? It's like the natural law. I mean,
Right.
yeah, you're not doing these things. It's, you know, you don't need to have legislation against it. And then you have even that legislation, and that goes against all of that. So that's what is here.
Taking out from what Adam was and Ken were talking about the issue of exemptions. They are in fact medieval. That issue of finding a different patron and then getting out of communal law. But they are also a feature of the colonial system, because Jews get capitulary rights to be subject to foreign powers. And this is in fact what leads to the modernization of Jews all around the Mediterranean basin. So it's very important. But so it's not just a function of the breakdown of the community in the early modern. It is in fact the way in which Jews always define their community identity based on relationships to the outside society. So it's a function of the way Jewish communal control is built. But just let me ask, in the case of Pisa and Livorno, I won't have time to talk about it in my thing, but one of the things that happens there is that the Livornese community is originally simply an adjunct of the Pisan community, on the grounds of cities being parts of networks, and they're really a mishlachat, a sort of an adjunct and things like that. At a certain point, they asked the Tuscan government to recognize their independence as a kihila, right, as a separate kihila. And they say that they have this right because there is no such thing in Jewish law as a kihila having control of a group of Jews or of a kihila in another city. Now the question is here, is there any reference when we talk about the jurisdictions and the separate things, does anybody try to define the space in a way that would then have halachic resonance, right? In other words, do they ever use that term, or is it just that they're playing this exemption and capitulation?
Well, here it is, and I think again that comparison of those sister communities, Spartans and Poznan, you have that process going on where they are trying to become independent,
and they're claiming status as a separate city.
That's right. But here again, I don't know. Again, I don't even have Jewish sources for this case in particular, so I don't know what the internal argument would have been. And again, this town is the city is rather small. Town is small.
But that would be an early modern function because the cities are growing and they're spreading out and they're, you know, that would.
A very simple question that touching on things we've already talked about, but I just want to get clarified. There's this wonderful passage where the one group of Jews takes the other Jews and throws them in a private prison, which I would assume just means locks them up for the night to make sure they don't, in a cellar or something, to make sure they don't run away before morning. But I wanted to know what really that, is there a deeper meaning to private prison, and does it touch on these juridical issues? I mean, is this, and what's the actual Polish term there?
When you say private prison, you mean just define private prison.
What is a private
But
prison?
it's just it's not the city prison.
Yeah.
So they have their own space and could be in a synagogue.
But the Kahal
But it
often
could
had
be,
its own
they could have their own prison.
had a room in which the prison its own prison.
So that, and you have that all the time. We have cases of Jews arresting nobles for not paying debts and being thrown to this Jewish prison. And so there exists these
We're back.
prisons.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.